So welcome back to Half Past Capitalism, where we talk about alternatives to capitalism as if they were possible. The show is indeed part of the Harbinger Media Network, and our guest today is Kevin Harding, a public policy professional who works with cooperatives and community enterprises. Kevin was deeply involved in the last-ditch effort to preserve the cooperative nature of Mountain Equipment Co-op, which will be the main thing we're talking about today. He's currently completing a PhD at the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks, Drew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming on. I just wanted to do a bit of a recap of what happened with MEC, Mountain Equipment Co-op. So for years, MEC was a giant in the Canadian cooperative landscape and something of a Canadian business success story. At its peak, it had about 5 million members, maybe even more, and hundreds of millions in annual revenues. Maybe you can fill in the proper numbers there later, Kevin. But for years, it operated on a basis that deviated pretty significantly from profit seeking. So the fact that it didn't have to turn a profit enabled all kinds of things that were pretty interesting. So, for example, they had a very progressive suite of environmental policies, and were leaders in environmental policy and sort of practices among Canadian businesses for decades. So that includes targeting zero waste. They wouldn't give you a bag unless you asked for one, for example, but that moved up the supply chain as well in terms of the packaging of all their sort of stuff they produced. They also had industry-leading energy efficiency, so they had LEED Platinum buildings. I remember the one in Montreal is still like one of these industry-leading type of buildings. And that was all way before that kind of thing was cool. And members could also get their gear repaired. So I had a friend who used to go, he would wear out his hiking boots and he would take them back and they just either repair or replace them, which is obviously just unheard of at any other kind of outdoor equipment store. That's sort of the opposite of profit seeking. It's like, okay, we're incentivizing ourselves to make gear last as long as possible. So as a cooperative, MEC was owned by each of its millions of members, but there was a widening chasm, I would say, between the membership and the people who sort of ran the co-op, the staff, and the small number of people who would be on the board each year. So in the 2000s, sort of late in the beginning of the 2010s, the board moved to turn that chasm into a wall, putting measures in place that effectively allowed them to handpick board members. So they basically had two different things. They would feature board members on the ballot. So they'd say featured candidate, but then also they would just reject board members. They gave themselves the power to reject board members from even running, thereby basically giving themselves the power to select the next board. Be like if Stephen Harper had been like, oh, well, I get to select the leader of the Liberal Party kind of thing. Just totally anti-democratic move. And though those moves were controversial, they were nothing compared to the shock that would come in 2020, which is obviously when the cooperative announced that it was simultaneously declaring bankruptcy. So it had run up, unbeknownst to a lot of people, and certainly to the members, it had run up unsustainable levels of debt and was in a crisis. And then subsequently, it used that as an opportunity to sell off all the co-op's assets to a US-based private equity fund. So for many members, for the ones who knew about it, this was a total betrayal of the cooperative values, and certainly, as co-owners of the co-op, they really had no say in how those assets and how that debt was dealt with. But truth be told, in the end, probably the vast majority of MEC's members had no idea what was going on. That said, Kevin, you were a part of this effort that mobilized certainly thousands, I think probably tens of thousands of people, maybe more, to try to stop this sort of fire sale of this multi-$100 million cooperatively owned institution. I guess the first question that I have for you is how does that summary sound to you? Do you think is there anything missing from there? Like, is there anything you would emphasize?
I think you covered off the basic of it really well. So Mountain Equipment Co-op MEC, as I think probably most members called it, was formed in I think 1971, and it was formed by a group of students at the University of British Columbia who were members of a hiking club. So really organic basis of starting off what became a multi-million-dollar business, multi-hundred-million-dollar business. They were facing problems where they couldn't buy climbing gear in Canada, and the easiest way for them to get the gear was to cross the border, drive down to Seattle, and buy it from REI, the American cooperative. And they built a buyers club essentially. They'd collect orders on order sheets. They'd pool money. They'd go across the border. They'd probably smuggle it back. To be perfectly honest, I'm sure that there was some adventures with the border at that point in time. And over the years, they built up this organization into something like you said that was world leading. That was Canada's largest consumer cooperative. And in 1971, when they made this decision to start this organization, there was a debate, but they very consciously built it as a co-op with very, very solid intention behind it to meet needs and not put profit above access, because those were the problems that they'd assessed with the outdoor equipment scene in Canada at this point in time. Some of them were university students, very idealistic. I know I was in university when I was idealistic. And so that's how it started. They when they started selling more retail oriented in Vancouver in the 1970s and 1980s, they started by selling out of a VW van that they would park and people would come and shop from there. The first tents and things that they sold were made by members. It was cooperative labor and production. They sold them out of an attic in someone's house in Kitsilano, and then over time they built up their business by buying a store, by putting in a workshop, and still making equipment. And then as they grew over time, they put principles into their purchasing. You mentioned things like low waste, but they also had sustainability and targets towards human rights. They had ups and downs with that throughout their history, but that was core to their business. They grew. They connected with other businesses in other provinces. They merged with other cooperatives. They grew themselves into a pan-Canadian organization. Core to that was that democracy in the heart of the business. At some point in time, members had actually a fair bit of influence in the way that the co-op was run. There was debates over whether or not things like products from occupied Palestine should be sold in stores, or whether products connected to arms manufacturers should be sold in stores, and members made their voices heard, and it was fascinating. It was an alternative way of doing business. But like you said, it seemed to be around the 2010s that the business took a really significant turn in how it managed itself, its principles, and its commitment to cooperativism instead of business capitalism, and it ended in 2020 in that really heartbreaking manner.
I meant to mention in the intro that I actually ran for the board in 2011 on and it was very much on some of those issues, like trying to up the environmental sort of standards and certainly the sort of solidarity with Palestine, because there was an Israeli weapons manufacturer that had some products that were in the store, so asking them to take those off the shelves as well, and to create a principled sort of ethical sourcing policy, but obviously that was building on what was already like a
Yeah.
head and shoulders above all the all the other ethical sourcing policies out
Yeah.
there. So it's like it's relative speaking, but obviously you hold a co-op to a higher standard. But in terms of what you were just saying, like when the turn was happening, do you have a sense of where that came from, or what started that? I mean, my sense of it is that you had people. Part of the problem is that you don't have a culture of cooperation in terms of the people who can run a business that big. So when you hire people, you're hiring from the private sector, and then you get these people who are sort of formed in like profit making and advancing their careers and maximizing profit, and you get them in a situation where they're heading up this thing that's like not needing to make profit, not wanting to make profit, not mandated to make profit, and yet they're running it as if it's that, and then somehow, and now it has become that. But I guess, my question for you is like, what kinds of clues have you picked up in your travels about like how how that shift happened.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it, it's a bit of an adventure that MEC had in its lifetime. Um, like any organization, there's always like a degree of growth or a degree of expansion that they were able to sort of engage in as they matured as an organization, matured as a business. And you often had examples of growing pains with that. Like the name of the co-op was Mountain Equipment Co-op, and some of the core members from the 1970s, I can remember in the late 1990s when Mountain Equipment Co-op started carrying things like kayaks or canoes or bicycles. Members were really upset at that point because they saw that as a diversion from the core principle of the cooperative. And members had a debate, the board had a debate, and the idea was that the core purpose of a cooperative is to meet members' needs. It's not to generate profit. It's that members of a co-op have a problem. They have an access to market problem. They have an access to resources problem or finance or something like that. And that they've determined that the best way to solve it is by working together and supporting each other rather than underbidding and overpaying and things like that. So when Mountain Equipment Co-op went in the direction of carrying things like kayaks, it was because members couldn't access something, and the members determined to provide those services and those products and those support to help each other out. But it seems to have been around the 2010s, late or early 2010s, sometime in then, that there was really a market shift away from growing stepwise, step by step, in order to meet needs and to continue providing services that members needed, and they shifted it a little bit in towards growing the membership to meet the business's needs. It's like a nuanced shift, but it was really fundamental because you go from what do our members need and what can they not access to how many members do we need to grow our book of business. And there were a lot of things that went in at that same time. They started hiring, like you said, from the private sector. So like large retail businesses started coming on. They hired executives from there to drive their product strategy and their marketing strategy. There were little signals in the development of the co-op that people saw from the outside. One was abandonment of the name Mountain Equipment Co-op for the logo MEC, and people saw that as a hint of problems to come. And honestly, a lot of us should probably have listened to those people like who raised those concerns in the early 2010s. And then it was that really significant restructuring of the internal democracy of the cooperative, where you ran for the board. I once considered running for the board, and I had been elected onto the board of a university for 3 years, a multi-$100 million public institution. And even then, I didn't have the background of large multi-$100 million a year businesses that was like the base minimum criteria to be considered for election to the board. And it was these little things that added up to start to create problems. And I mean, I'm sure you can imagine it, that once you narrow the range of perspectives and opinions that sit around the board table, and your members, who the definition of the business is supposed to be meeting their needs, they're not being heard because of the people that are around the table, the direction of the business might go in one way where members want it to go in another. And that's that beginning of that chasm that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's a really interesting sort of I appreciate how structural that analysis is. It's not like a individual failing, but it's more of a systemic look at what happened there. I mean, it's easy for me to imagine. I mean, I tend to look at things systemically, but even in this case, it's like there's
Yeah.
some kind of nefarious thing that happened. Like somebody made a decision at some point. Obviously, I guess we don't know when that happened, but clearly it did.
Yeah.
Like clearly somebody was like, we're going to keep this
Mhm.
secret and we're going to sell it off, and we're going to hoodwink the members,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of little things that in 2020 we were able to look back at and say, okay, in 2016 they did this, in 2013 they hired this person. They hired some people from mass market jewelry and clothing chains to start to be vice presidents and senior executives in various places, and you can point to that, but like there are elemental individuals that you can point at that were perhaps symptoms of the bigger thing, and then there were bigger strategic issues that came up. Like to me, from the systemic perspective, the big thing is the change from their initial strategy as an organization, which was make sure that we can meet members' needs. And if we identify a gap where members' needs aren't being met, then maybe that's an opportunity to grow. And then their strategy shifted from that into let's grow the members as much as we can by throwing everything we can at them to get the book of business bigger and bigger and bigger. So one is like mass market retail, where you can walk into a big box store and not walk out for a week because there's this many products that you never knew you needed. And the other one is one that's focused, a smaller store with maybe a more curated selection of products, but that are founded on understanding the member owners rather than growing the customer base. And it's like that shift, but then individuals enabled that shift, and then a narrowing of the perspectives around the board table cemented that shift, and then it led to business decisions and big problems.
Yeah, so I guess you were on the front lines of this sort of battle. Where there was a
Mm-hmm.
legal challenge, like thousands of people gave money to help with the effort to like stop MEC from being sold off. All these things. Can you
Mm-hmm.
describe a little bit about what that effort looked like?
Oh yeah, it. I still sort of look back at that time and think about how at the height of the COVID pandemic that we managed to somehow pull together tens of thousands of Canadians who connected the only way that we could online through WhatsApp and Facebook and all of these things to oppose like a giant corporate sale. It was bizarre, but it was also the spirit of the co-op trying to assert itself in some sense or another. Um, it started with this surprise announcement on CBC radio that the co-op was being sold, and I remember being heartbroken because co-ops and cooperatives are core to where I see that society needs to go to build a better possibility. And I wanted to get out there and just share with people that this was probably a business failure. Like numbers on a spreadsheet were done somewhere wrong. Somebody made a poor strategic decision. It wasn't a failure of the co-op model. And it turned out that there were dozens, hundreds of people talking about that when I woke up in the morning, because it had hit in Eastern time zone before it hit in the Pacific time zone. And a lot of folks gathered together online on Facebook. There was a Zoom meeting that was called. There were people and organizers with lots of experience in political party organizing or union labor organizing. They convened a great group of people, and really everyone pulled together in ways that they could. I'd had experience with co-ops in the past. I've worked in business development supporting co-ops and credit unions, so I was there providing what I could. We had communications experts who were francophones that would translate everything that we developed into French. We had an online campaigner who gave us the tools and the framework and the structure to make this happen. There were people behind the scenes pulling together experts from lawyers, and everything came together. But what it really was like was that theory of coordination between people who want to coordinate together and voluntarily associate. Like it was the heart of what a co-op is supposed to be. We had a problem that we wanted to solve, which was that this organization that we owned and that was ours was being sold out without notice and without consultation, and we needed to organize around it. And people did. And it was an astounding period of time.
And so can you just sketch out like how that played out, like
Yeah.
without getting too into the weeds? Obviously there's like legal briefings and all kinds of
Hmm.
stuff we could dig into, but
You bet.
just in I'm sure you were fully immersed in it for a certain amount of time,
Yeah.
but yeah, what did that look like? Do you feel like you ever came close to being successful? I mean, I feel like there were some people who were very convinced that it was possible
Oh,
to turn this back.
there's such a good question. How close do we get? And I think that this is something that's fascinating. We this group of people, this group of dozens of hundreds of people that were like the core organizing team. We existed on Slack for weeks and Zoom meetings and things like that. Um, we pulled together tens of thousands of people, and we pulled together like support and advice from large cooperative financial institutions, credit unions, insurance companies. Uh, we were really remarkably close to being able to do this, and what ended up hitting us was the legal system. So the problem that we faced here was that MEC was in a position where the money that it owed was bigger than the money that it had, and the pandemic had hit them hard. Supply chain issues had hit them really hard, so they weren't generating a huge amount of revenue. They'd started off secretly under non-disclosure agreements, sort of shopping around to try to figure out how they could get a loan from a banking consortium renegotiated. And it turned out that it was getting kind of hard to do that because they were talking to banks, and banks didn't want to really do this for them. And so their financial advisors, which hilariously was also their bankruptcy advising firm, told them, you really just need to start looking around to sell. And then this US capital firm came up and said, well, we'll buy it. We'll pay off your outstanding loans. We'll own the business and things will be done. And part of that agreement to sell the assets of the business was that they'd go out under the Canadian Companies Creditors Arrangements Act, this federal bankruptcy legislation that came from the Great Depression that allowed them to circumvent all the bylaws of the co-op and all the provincial laws and have a judge stamp a piece of paper that says, despite everything else, you can sell the business. And that was the condition of sale. So they went to the Supreme Court in British Columbia. They did an ex parte application, protect us, allow us to start this sale. And that was when members first heard of it. And that was when we started organizing online, when we started a petition, started an email list, we started a GoFundMe. We didn't even start the GoFundMe to begin with. We were just outraged and meeting people together. But some law firms stepped up, offered pro bono support and representation. We felt it was important to pay them at least a certain amount of their time because they were doing so much work to support us. And Canadians across the country and around the world stepped up and put money into a GoFundMe to pay off some of those legal bills. The lawyers assisted us in a challenge, and they'd had a lot of experience with these kinds of bankruptcy arrangements, with this law that allows companies to, walk away from pension obligations, walk away from unpaid wages, and deliver assets into other corporate buyers. And they told us that really one of the only ways that we'd be able to succeed is if we pitched an alternate arrangement, another way to satisfy the loans that would allow the cooperative to continue, that would be competitive to the prearranged American investment capital firm. And so the organizing team and myself, we pulled together advisors from the co-op and credit union financial sector from across the country. And there was a very real possibility that had there even been 5 business days worth of time to look at the books of Mountain Equipment Co-op, that the credit unions and the financial institutions would have gotten past their due diligence obligations. A credit union is owned by members. It can't just risk money because these are people's homes and people's savings. But if they'd gotten enough time to look at the books, because the company still exists, it's still doing business, it's existing, there's a valid case to be made. If they could get that level of trust, they would have been able to put up sufficient funds to bridge the co-op through the challenging time. We would have been able to pull together a board of experts that could have stepped in and run the co-op and rearranged things, keeping jobs and activities going. And this story wouldn't have been the same. But this law from the 1940s is not written to allow that. It's designed to satisfy banks and to satisfy lenders. It's not designed to prioritize social capital or communities. And because of the way that the law is written, and because the judge is duty bound to follow the law, this reasonable 5-day pause to look at the books wasn't permitted. And that's really where the core of the problem came from and fell apart. And it was 5 days and we would have been able to do it.
That's unreal, and so interesting to see that sort of cooperation in action. I mean, obviously, we all have our critiques and bones to pick with all the big financial institutions and so on. But the fact that there was a possibility that all of this other cooperative infrastructure could have been mobilized to keep MEC alive, if only the people there had any clue, really, or any inkling or intention of operating in a cooperative context, as opposed to just doing a fire sale. But that's super interesting.
That's so true, because the root business problem here, not to sound too much like a business analyst, because I'm not, but the root business problem with Mountain Equipment Co-op is that they went into this expansion phase, like you'll see with a lot of other businesses. They thought, Calgary needs 3 Mountain Equipment Co-ops, Saskatoon needs 2, Vancouver needs 4. And so they started signing these big leases and these big renovation plans to renovate malls, to have their stores built. And it was just too much all at once. They had this giant loan that they needed to pay. This was completely 180 degrees opposite from how they'd previously done things, which was buy land, build a store, sit on it for a while until there's demonstrated need somewhere else. And because of that aggression in entering the market, you'll see with all kinds of other, retail, private firms, they just ran into this zone where they couldn't pay the bills. And that was the core problem. But their loan was from a bank. It was from the big 5 banks in Canada. And the credit union sector had always been a little bit upset that Mountain Equipment Co-op, Canada's largest retail co-op, hadn't done loans through the credit union sector, because then there would have been aligned interests and principles and support, where the banks, they just want their bills paid. Credit unions want to support communities and their members in a different direction. So, that was another opportunity that, in the 80s or the 90s or the early 2000s, that should have been taken, because if you can build the system in a different direction, you don't have to worry about profit taking at 16 levels. It's just,
Yeah, I remember at a certain point in the 20 teens, at some point, you had mech people sort of saying, "Oh well, you can't just stop growing when you're that big, because you have to
yeah.
keep, because there's a sort of a financial imperative to keep growing." And I guess that was the justification for them opening up
Mhm.
all these like urban sort of boutique yoga shops and changing the logo.
Yeah.
Um, to that ugly thing that's just totally generic, which is fascinating, because
Yeah.
as soon as the private equity bought it, they went back to the old logo, which I
They went
found
back to the old logo. Yeah.
totally fascinating. Anyway, it's just sort of a side note. But what do you make of that case that was being made at the time? Like, I mean, I've never run a $700 million a year co-op, so I don't
Yeah.
know. But like, do you have to keep growing? I'm assuming you do, but and there's different ways to do it. But you tell me.
Yeah. This is like a core question to a lot of co-ops right now in the country. Like, there's always going to be some degree of growth that a cooperative business needs to get into, because members, they may resign their membership, they may leave the country, they might not need that business any longer. So you need to have that base minimum amount of core members interacting with you to sustain your business. But a co-op, one of the core differences between a co-op and a private company is that the members are the owners, and members are looking to make sure that they've got a place they can buy their hiking boots or get their bike repaired. They're not investors that are looking for a 3.5% annual dividend. So when you're in an investment oriented firm, you need to generate growth to satisfy the investors. But when you're in a co-op, you just need to make sure that members' needs are met, and you can de-link that growth imperative. There's dozens of credit unions across the country that are, like they're the core credit unions, like employees credit unions, Toronto Municipal Employees Credit Unions that used to exist. There's lots of these really awesome, union backed credit unions or community backed credit unions, where their growth is through patient capital, supporting their members who, are blocked from other financial transactions because of things like gender or where they live or their personal economic history. And to them, growth is success and helping members succeed. And that's what co-ops can do as well. But when you have a leadership team or an executive team at a retail co-op that doesn't understand that growth isn't actually the imperative for a co-op as it is for a private business, then you get into the zone where you need aggressive expansion and expand your product selection massively and things like that. That's what co-ops really need to keep in mind, is that growth is something that you can plan for carefully, but that's not your core imperative as a cooperative business.
Yeah, and there are also different directions to grow in. I mean, obviously, the Mountain Equipment Co-op was like
Yeah.
selling designer jeans and doing all these things, and it wasn't
Yeah.
even working, which is the ironic part. But
No.
yeah.
Yeah.
And coming back to the sort of high drama that we were in the middle of before I started talking about growth.
Yeah.
Uh, with the when you're at the BC Supreme Court, is there, and
Yeah.
BC has an NDP government at the moment, and I believe
Yeah.
David Eby's the Attorney General at that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, he was at that point in time. Yeah.
So is there nothing he can do,
Oh,
or or
this
or
is
or,
this is
or, or did he just not want to do it?
this is one of these moments of complete and utter heartache in what happened. Is that when when the sale was announced, and when the community, the members came together to start to organize, there were immediate connections to the provincial government in British Columbia. There are a number of cabinet ministers and elected MLAs at the moment, and even then, who had been on boards of credit unions or boards of co-ops, and they know, and they also know the history of the NDP as the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation that had a core plank of its philosophy being, we need to replace the economy with cooperatives. So they get the idea. But unfortunately, 3 days after this started happening, the premier called an election. And so at that point, literally nothing the province could do, because, I mean, policy nerds will know the government goes into this zone of like no commitments, no nothing, just maintain the ship of state. So, was there something the province could have done? The province, at that point, we were at the height of COVID. All levels of government were throwing billions of dollars at businesses to sustain economies. This was like a $300 million loan that MEC needed to solve itself. And the products that MEC makes, there's a lot of them that could be made in British Columbia, the home of the cooperative, that could have provided employment. This would have made a perfectly reasonable economic case at the height of COVID. But because that election was being called, we had literal lines of communication with cabinet ministers. They all had to stop because an election was called, unfortunately, at that particular point in time.
What
Yeah.
what about what a timing situation. Wild.
Yeah.
And in terms of that, I mean, I'm that was one of the things that I ran on, not really knowing, just knowing that that I thought it was a good idea, but the fact that like you have a consumer co-op, so why can't,
Mm-hmm.
but that produces things and
Mm-hmm.
sells things, so why can't that consumer co-op then, like they do in Japan, go upstream and say, okay, let's start using this like $700 million in revenue that we have and channel some portion of that to worker co-ops that produce things, and then
Mm-hmm.
put the things in the stores and sell to the consumers. And I'm curious what your sort of take is on that. Like, I mean, you sort of mentioned that, yeah, there was possibility of creating things
Mm-hmm.
in British Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
but can you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah. It takes me back, like in 2013 through 2016, I was working in the co-op sector with co-op associations, and I actually did a fair bit of work with MEC, and it always was a fun adventure because I'd hear from members and people organizing around the democracy in the co-op, and then I was in the zone where they were a member of the organization I was in, and there was lines to be drawn. And I can remember being in Quebec City and going to the MEC in Quebec City, and the staff members there, they had shirts and it said membre et équipe, right, like member and staff at the same time. And that was like, that's pretty awesome. You're a member of the co-op and your staff. Like, that's a really good way to reinforce this. And in English Canada, it was just staff. There was none of this dual terminology that the French language manages to bring in that connection to cooperativism. But when we were looking at the economic picture and trying to make a case for things like government intervention, or why MEC, what about investment from foreign firms? What about Canadian interests? All of these weird sort of nationalist things. Um, One of the criticisms that members had organized around, and I think you probably were aware of it too, was that a lot of mountain equipment co-ops production had been moved overseas into potentially quite exploitative environments, and there had been a lot of push to change up, either to improve working conditions or to meet human rights standards, and MEC had been working, if you believe their reports, in that direction. But also there was a lot of research into innovative product design, new ways of designing clothing, new fabrics that meet outdoor conditions. And there's a government program to support that kind of innovation in BC, and there are in other provinces and federally. In that, there are tax benefits and things like that. So there could have been an investment made to what was called at the time reshoring production, bring production back to Canada, to employ people who reside in Canada to design and build these products and then sell them through a cooperative. There was a lot of potential there, and that was something that people in government had been interested in. But timing was our enemy here, because the board did all of this in secret and didn't ask anyone their opinion before they sold.
So you talked about the 5 days that you
Yeah,
needed to like save the co-op, but I'm just wondering if we go back a little further in time, like
yeah.
when would have been the sort of ideal moment in MEC's history for some kind of critical mass of members to try to intervene to
Yeah.
change it? Like, where was the fork in the road?
Yeah, it was. I mean, if I'm going to look back, it was probably around 2011 to 2013, which was when a lot of these structural changes started being made. The But prior to 2013, and in that zone, the direction of the co-op had been that stepwise growth, meeting requirements of a critical mass of members that are X number of hours away, and where is there a reasonable place to build a store and things like that. But from about 2013 onwards, there was that shift, the change of the logo, the hiring of people from large retail clothing stores. And then it was at that point that the co-op started its aggressive expansion platform. Like in Montreal, they opened up that boutique yoga store on Saint Denis, right? Like it wasn't a mountain equipment co-op; it was the bottom of a storefront retail kind of place in a Canada's huge shopping district. And it was this idea then that everything had to grow in a certain standard retail direction. If if members hadn't been locked out, because this was the same time that governance of the co-op had been changed, that members were no longer allowed to just run for the board. You had to meet this secretive list of qualifications that basically locked you out unless you were a multimillionaire kind of thing. It's that nexus, that connection of events, the brand change, the aggressive growth, the retail orientation, and the governance changes that prevented members from being on the board and instead focused on people who thought retail was the way to go. So that's where I'd put my finger on it as the point that a difference needed to have started.
Well, that's personally validating. Anyway, because I ran for the board in 2011, and then we started a organization after that called MEC Members for a Democratic Co-op, and published 2 open letters that got like, I don't know, 700 signatures or something. But clearly that wasn't enough. Clearly there needed to be some kind of bigger institutional intervention, and probably frankly legal, because MEC, when MEC, because when they snuck through those changes, they were like, oh, we're going to like modernize our governance. Like, and then like when the ballot came, because they had to get the members to vote for this. Like, so they sent it out to their 4 million members or whatever. They said, oh, would you like to modernize governance and update things so that they're cool? And we were like, no, don't do it. But like, obviously if people like, you have to click on the fine print and then like read through it and understand all this like legalese in order to be able to say, oh no, that's actually a bad idea. Like that's not modernization at all. That's just de-democratization. But obviously it was, they had control of that. And so the only strategy that probably would have worked there is a legal one, or some kind of like, if there was an intense enough crew, some kind of direct action, which frankly, that was the only avenue that made sense to me at that time, but I wasn't able to sort of get it going. But what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I can remember when Mountain Equipment Co-op proposed this modernization of their governance, the way that they described it was like making sure that we have the right experience around the table and stuff like that. Like really just sort of generic statements that in general sound right. And you would have really had to have dove deep into the fine print of the proposal to understand the potential implications of what was coming out of that. And even at that point, and even now, the laws in this country that sort of create what a co-op is probably wouldn't have prevented those kinds of changes, because the law sort of takes a step back. It's a co-op, it's democratic. If the members choose to do something, unless it's against some other law, the courts aren't going to get involved. So really, the work for the members for a democratic co-op that was inspiring and that sort of created the core organizing principles that the members who tried to stop the sale built on was what needed to be done. It's just there's all kinds of like weird little policy wonky things, like this 6 million members that MEC says. No one's really sure how many of those members were still, I don't know, alive because it was a $5 thing. MEC could throw all kinds of things at you, like you needed 10% of the members to make sure that there was a special general meeting, but then they would say that's 600,000, but they wouldn't let you verify things. Like they had all of these little student union kind of Robert's Rules of Order tools they could shut down organizing. And so it probably would have been that mass membership organizing that would have needed to occur. But because MEC had taken this corporate retail growth approach, $5 membership, you can go in and buy your shoes and never interact with us again. They were able to create this mass number of members that would never engage. And then they'd have a smaller number of members that would actively vote for things if the board told them that it was what they should do. And yeah, failure of engagement, failure of democracy. It was really sad.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like in hindsight, I actually go back quite a bit further than 2011. I mean, obviously there was a
Hmm.
turning point there,
Hmm.
but it seemed like the deck was stacked against us. Like if you once you're in control of like a co-op that's that big
Yeah.
with that little civil society
Yeah.
layer, like there's nothing anyone can do really,
Yeah.
except unless there's a legal avenue, which you seem to be suggesting there was not. So
Not at the
I would go
moment.
back to
Yeah.
like I don't know the 80s or 90s when it's like okay you're growing now you're
Yeah.
opening stores in different cities. At that point, do you
Yeah.
adapt your structure and say okay we're not just going to have one national board but we're going to have well we'll have a national
Yeah.
board but we'll also have a board for each store and they're going to have
Yeah.
create more of a federated model where it's like oh this
Hmm.
local board is going to have control over X, Y, and Z at this
Hmm.
store, even if some of the company wide or cooperative wide policy is set at the national level, and
Yeah.
then you would get that sort of layer of sort of organization and civil society and consultation and organic connection with
Hmm.
members that you just don't have when you have like five people who are sort
Yeah.
of happen to get on the board somehow.
Yeah. I agree with you completely. And this was something that I can remember. I can remember a lot of people talking about in the early 2000s and pointing at MEC's growth over time. Like when they first moved out of British Columbia into another province, there was a similar concept of a co-op that was existing in Calgary. And rather than forming a federation with like a central buying entity and then separate stores, they amalgamated instead of they took this choice, and so that's maybe if you're going to apply like a historical materialist or something like they made a choice at this point to amalgamate rather than to democratize, and that might have been one of the key decision points. If we look at, I mean, all co-ops of great scale have this problem to some degree of this engagement in this civic relationship. But if we look at other successful cooperatives in Canada that despite their warts and their ugly bits still exist and still make differences in communities, you've got Desjardins in Quebec and in some parts of Franco Ontario and Atlantic Canada, where they have local boards for the local branches of the case of the credit unions. So that way, you might have like a labor union oriented credit union that's a member of the Desjardins movement. You might have a Catholic credit union that's a member of the Desjardins movement. You might have one in a certain area that's a certain, sociocultural background, and that keeps the individual branches of the credit union responsive to the community in the domain that they can be responsive. And then you have a delegation system, so that way the movement in Quebec and in Montreal, the large, the core central financial management is done in a removed but still accountable way. Federated Co-ops Limited in the prairies, again, warts and ugly bits. They own a refinery, and maybe there's some improvements that they could make around there, like a lot of improvements in some governance structures there. But still, federated co-ops in a large part of the rural and the more prairie parts of this country is the only thing that keeps communities alive, and they invest and they employ in local communities, and they are transformative in the prairies in terms of the economic solidity, even just being able to buy food at an accessible location that's affordable. Private businesses won't go there. Jimmy Pattison, Save on Foods, from that's slowly colonizing the rest of the grocery store landscape in Canada, won't go into these parts of the country, but a co-op will. And they do that in that decentralized but coordinated way, where there's a corporate buying that is owned by all the co-ops, but then the local stores are still managed democratically. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's probably
Federated
something.
is such a fascinating example. I mean, the way somebody put it
Yeah.
was like, oh, well, they have a $1 billion tar sands refinery, but the revenues from that refinery are like holding together like these rural communities in like Manitoba and
No,
Saskatchewan, right?
that's
So
exactly it. Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, we all have hope in terms of large corporate changes and recognition that we need to get away from oil. But at the same time, yeah, this refinery keeps communities alive through the way that the revenues, because it's a co-op. There aren't shareholders profiting off of this refinery. It's going back in to subsidize the food and the retail operations that keep communities alive. It's a mix of evil and
yeah.
good in one business.
I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, obviously, democracy is in no way like a panacea. It just gives
No.
you a fighting chance to like make the right thing happen. But
Yeah.
but it's ultimately like, I mean, with Desjardins, it's the same thing. It's like,
Yeah.
you can do things like get, I don't know, this is like 30 branches of Desjardins had
Yeah.
like Greenpeace came and like got them
Yeah.
to like sign a thing being like, we're going to divest from the tar sands. And
Yeah.
I think they just didn't do it. But, and, but it's obviously full of contradictions, because it's like, these are
Yeah.
people who are, they're not, just being part of a co-op doesn't make them, have the same motivations as we would
No,
maybe like
exactly.
them to, or to have the same values. Like, they're, probably
Hmm.
there's a lot of CAQ voters in there. There's a lot of,
Just like with,
yeah,
members of
it's
other retail co-ops, there's conservative members that are on
exactly.
boards, right? Like, yeah.
But it does give you that sort of social fabric. And it was interesting. Like,
Yeah.
and just another anecdote, like it was like 20, must have been around 2009 or something. I was at a big co-op conference in Quebec City with these big
Hmm.
fancy hotels and stuff. And it was like, we're in this big, just like giant hotel ballroom. And
Yeah.
the CEO of Desjardins gets up to give this big speech. And she's like, capitalism isn't working. And I was
Yeah.
like, to a room full, like, with like I don't know, 600 people in it or something,
Yeah.
all from these different cooperative businesses. And it's like, wow, this is just this alternate universe. I mean, even if
Yeah.
she only believes that on a certain level, it's still, you would never hear the CEO of a major bank say that, right? Like, and this is
Yeah.
one of the major banks in Canada. So,
No, exactly. I mean, what
um,
you just mentioned there, that idea of like a social fabric. In my time in the sector, and I still work with the sector, I study it at my PhD program. One of my favorite things is that you do get this eclectic combination of people with different political orientations and political backgrounds, but they are also personally involved in an alternate form of economic organization, and they might be the most, right wing Albertan person in a farm. Not that Alberta is necessarily the be all and end all, but they might be super conservative, super right wing, but they also know that this way of doing business is better for them, their families, and their communities, because it takes this profit motive, this exploitation out of things. And so you do get these weird scenarios where you're in a room with hundreds of people from around the world that are heads of multi-billion-dollar organizations, and they all will agree with you that capitalism as it is right now is not working, and it is just it's cognitively dissonant, but it's amazing to see how an economic organization can change people's minds at that level while maybe not changing their hearts at the political level.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like that, having the space to say that is one of the like many sort of mostly invisible benefits of like a
Yeah,
cooperative structure, because
exactly.
you don't have to like hew to
You
the
can
same
point to an existing alternative, right? Like, it's
yeah.
it's prefigurative politics in a sense. Is you can say, look, there is another way of doing things. They exist in capitalism. They have to right now because of the way that the economy is structured, but they are also proof that there's another way to do it.
And in some ways it's like that ideological layer that somehow is missing, because co-ops are just focused on such a, in some ways focused on the mandate that you're talking about at the
Yeah.
beginning. It's like, okay, you meet the needs of your members. And
Hmm.
so when you're in rural Saskatchewan, even though everybody's like voting for Stephen Harper
Yeah.
or whoever, or the Saskatchewan party, like
Yeah.
they're also, even like, they understand and appreciate the benefits of the immediate,
Yes.
structure of like, whether it's, the federated co-op or
Hmm.
SaskTel, which is like,
Hmm.
provincially owned, or
Hmm.
whatever. Like, they understand those things, but there's no ideological structure for them to like make that make sense in a political sense. And so they're like, oh, we'll just,
Exactly.
keep voting conservative, even though conservatives are very actively tearing up that social and economic fabric that's been
Yeah.
carefully created.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, this is maybe one of the biggest strategic errors the co-op movement has ever made in its life, is to stick out of the politics and focus on the policy. Like, co-ops are always focused on, let's adjust regulations here. Let's change this word in this piece of legislation. But it has, ever since the CCF and went the way of the NDP, there's no one's been making the case for the bridge between the economic and the social. Like, in Quebec, there's a little bit more of that because there's this fascinating confluence of cultural preservation and nationalistic sentiments that can go into the co-op form, and this uniquely Quebec form of doing business. That's special, and if that could translate into Anglo Canada, maybe there'd be hints of changes in other places too.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like it needs to be embedded in. I mean, in some ways, it's the advantage that it has right now is that it's not embedded in a political project, and so it doesn't.
That's true.
It evades the sort of culture war, but that's also the downside in the
Yeah.
sense that
No, exactly.
that lived experience of, oh, this co-op is benefiting my family and this business
Yeah.
model is better than this other one, doesn't translate into any bigger political anything. It just
No,
is
very true.
there until it's torn
Yeah.
up by some conservative hack, um, or NDP, as it case may be.
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, I wanted to come back to MEC, so that was
Yeah.
a good digression. But I'm really curious about. I mean, just to nerd out on the
Yeah.
specifics of it, like I'm curious about the member list.
Yeah.
What was the legal basis? Because this co-op still exists; it just sold all its
Oh,
assets,
yeah.
but it's still a co-op. It still has
Yeah.
like a number on it. I don't
Yeah.
know. It's like the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yeah. It's something
Canada
like that.
cooperative or something. It still exists
Yeah.
there, but
Yeah.
what happened to all the members? Like it must have it. Like if it still exists, it should still have its member list. But tell me what happened there.
This is this weird zone where there actually have been some legal changes to try to solve some of this problem if it ever comes up again, and let's all hope that it never comes up again. But what we've got a scenario here is that there was a corporate entity, a co-op, that had 6 million members, and there was a member list, and there was this weird problem because the member list was in this retail software thing that they used at the cash registers, and as part of the sale arrangement, the company that bought Mountain Equipment Co-op didn't get the member list. And what we tried to do was use our rights as members under the Cooperative Act of British Columbia to access that member list to organize people, to get emails, get phone numbers, organize people. Maybe we could build something out of this. And the the lawyers for the co-op, when we had made an application saying give us the member list, the lawyers for the co-op went to the judge in the bankruptcy case and made up a whole bunch of stuff. Like at one point, the lawyer said that I was a danger to the public because there's got to be judges that have membership at Mountain Equipment Co-op, and do you really want Kevin to have your home address? And I found that personally very insulting because I wasn't going to do anything other than try to help members organize. But it's this disconnect because we had the right; it was in the law. And what the judge ended up doing was very carefully. The judge did not rule and say that the law was wrong and that members couldn't have access to the membership list. The judge just said that under this bankruptcy legislation that exists in Canada, making the co-op produce the member list right now would take up too much time. So I'm just going to say no to that. And she has the right. It's federal law, and federal law trumps provincial law in this case. And our lawyers pushed hard on it, and the judge, probably sensing that she would have been overturned if we'd appealed it, wrote it in a way that it was pretty much unappealable because it was under the bankruptcy legislation, and just said not enough time. Now, since then, the sale concluded. All of the directors from Mountain Equipment Co-op resigned, and we're in this bizarre legal zone where there's no directors to call an annual general meeting. And because no directors can call the annual general meeting, there can't be an annual general meeting, and therefore there can't be elections. So it's a black hole in the law. Uh, since then, the legislature in British Columbia changed a core part of the Cooperative Act that says that if members are in the situation where they're demanding these records and the co-op says no, then they've given power to a government official to step in and demand that the records be published. So that's good. But in the MEC case, we don't know where the member list is. The computers might have been deleted. The company says they don't have it. It's gone, and it breaks my heart because there's 50 years worth of history of building a co-op that might have ended up in a recycling bin in Kitsilano somewhere, and nobody preserved it because the company didn't have the right to preserve it, but also there was no money left to even pay for an archivist. Like we had archives, the Vancouver archives, there was the British Columbia archives that was interested in even just preserving under seal these records because maybe in 100 years they'd be valuable. But I don't know. U.S. equity investment firms don't care about history, don't care about organizing. They just care about money.
How much of the sort of lesson of this is applicable to other co-ops? Like, do you think that there's a threat of this happening to other co-ops, and where do you see that sort of threat happening or potentially happening in the near future?
Yeah, there absolutely is a threat of this for other co-ops. There's a lot of co-ops that are positioned to weather it relatively well. Like if I'm looking at the big financial credit unions, they were paying attention throughout all of this. They've learned lessons, but they're also big enough that they're probably not going to run into like the very specific too much loan, not enough money problem. That's probably not going to happen to credit unions, also because there's a lot of protection insurance and things like that. But there's other places in Canada and in the world where this is becoming a problem. In New Zealand, sorry, random country, but in New Zealand, there's a lot of dairy cooperatives that are being bought out by multinational dairy companies because of this problem. They can come in and they can offer farmers a huge amount of money to buy their co-op from them, but it's a one-time payment, and then the farmers are in the position of the co-op, which gave them access to markets, which paid for transportation of goods, which made their businesses function. That's no longer theirs. And this international dairy concern can now jack up the prices and reduce the payments. It's kind of like how Uber comes in and destroys taxi companies. You know, we put a lot of money in, we make the product good, and then we jack up the prices afterwards. In Canada, there is some hints that in some places there are potential challenges for some grocery or food cooperatives. Federated in Calgary, the Calgary Co-op moved away from Federated Co-op Limited's buying arm, and instead they're now purchasing their bulk goods, like their supply from Save on Foods, which is something that the local members are maybe okay with tacitly, maybe not. It's not super clear in terms of the elections, but Calgary Co-op is the largest retail co-op in the Federated network, and that starts to put some challenge into Federated's broad business model too, because now that idea of stores banding together and getting economies of scale discounts is weakened a little bit. And you know, those are hints. You're going to see that in other places, and so co-ops need to reconnect with their members to prevent that from happening.
And the deal that capital can offer is always going to look better in the short
Yeah.
term. Like, I mean, I just remember
Yeah.
talking to my, some folks in my hometown who were part of a home heating co-op,
Yeah.
with the very successful, built up a nice little business. They all, the whole generation of guys or people retired, mostly guys. But they,
Yeah.
and then there was no one to hand it off to. So they were like, they got a really nice offer from some regional
Yeah.
company
Exactly.
to buy them out. And they were like, oh yeah, we promise we'll keep it like this. We'll do this. We'll do all these things.
Yeah.
And of course they're going to do that for like, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, maybe even 5 years.
Yeah.
But then, oh, they got sold to another big conglomerate of like home heating, whatever megacorp. And like all of a sudden it's gutted. Right. And it's like, oh, no, so that's too bad. A generation of building relationships and value is just like,
exactly.
So it can really be tragic, and really the only thing that could carry you through that is sort of an ideological understanding in some ways, to be like, okay, we know how this plays out, even though the deal looks really good in the short term.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. I mean, the farmers who are part of demutualized dairy cooperatives that are now just selling to like some kind of Italian dairy concern, they realize now that they're getting paid less for the product that they used to sell, but the price that's going out to consumers is more. And so who's pocketing the difference, right? Like that's something that you get $100,000 for your share to buy out the co-op, but then amortize that over the rest of the years that you or your family want to have your farm producing. Maybe this wasn't a good benefit. And there are some parts of the country that are recognizing that they need to go in the other direction and rebuild these pieces of cooperative infrastructure to keep their communities. Like rural Alberta has got a lot of these rural economic cooperatives to reinvest locally. But if you can't connect the two disparate sides of this equation, people who've experienced what it's like to demutualize and the people who are remutualizing because they need to meet their community's needs, then the story, you only get half of it at one point in time. And you're right, capital tells you a really good deal. Give you $150,000 for your share right now. Like imagine in Vancouver where you got to work 3 jobs to afford a place to live. You can't afford a car, so we've got this really amazing auto co-op, Moto, the car co-op. It's got places across the province, connections with co-ops in other provinces. If a car rental agency came in and offered members, a good deal, we'll buy you out, and then suddenly, you had $16 worth of fuel surcharges. You can only book them for an hour. All of these things. You'd have a little bit of money, but the thing that kept you going to work or taking vacations would be gone. And yeah.
I mean, that's the thing about having capital is if you have a big pile of money, you can always amortize it over time, right? You can be like, oh,
Exactly.
we'll give you 150 grand now, but we'll call that back and then some, over the next 10 years
Yeah,
or whatever.
it's exactly what the American company that bought MEC is doing. Like, they came in, they bought the assets, and really what that meant is that they deducted the loan, and then they got the stores, the land, the goods in the stores for like pennies on the dollar. And then one of the first things they did was they sold the land under the stores. They sold the stores and they rented it back. Classic private equity move, because then the companies pocketed hundreds of millions from the land, and the company that they really don't necessarily care a huge amount is just going to pay the rent. It's all going to be fine. And then people are now saying, hey, there's not as much selection as there used to be. There's not as many good products. MEC just opened up a store in the store in one of the Bay shops in Canada. And it's like, okay, great. So now the cost of these pants that used to be $15 is going to be 45 because you've got this next to like in Levi's booth where the jeans are $200 for a pair of jeans. Like all of that's going to slowly go away, and it's just going to be this fancy logo that is expensive and doesn't mean anything anymore.
Yeah, I made the mistake of buying some stuff from post fire sale mech. Like about I
Oh
just
yeah,
bought some gloves that were on sale, and like they fell apart
yeah,
within like, I don't know, a month. I was just like, okay, well, I learned my lesson.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. I've got
so
a
to end on a
backpack with the old mountain logo on it. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Oh no, go ahead.
No, I'm curious. There was some talk of, because
Hmm.
there's a significant amount of energy that got sort of mobilized, and obviously a lot of
Hmm.
people got involved and interested and excited. What where are the sort of next steps at? Like there was talk of creating a new co-op potentially,
Hmm.
the sort of a phoenix project of
Yeah,
sorts.
yeah.
Has there been any movement on that or any yeah, where's that at?
Yeah, there was a lot of excitement and energy in the final days of this whole process, and there was a lot of people who were really interested in building something new. And then the end of the co-op came. It was clear it was done, and there was a core group of people who were interested in it. We started doing things like business modeling and looking through products and stuff like that, and like the magic of MEC was that it started when there were no competitors in the country, that there was nowhere else anyone could go, and they built it on at first bulk ordering and smuggling shoes across the border kind of model to keep costs low, and we quickly came to the conclusion it was next to impossible to rebuild that magic in 2021. And so what people where people have gone from there is that there were a lot of people who started to get involved in their own local co-ops and credit unions. There's still active chat in the mostly dormant Facebook group about gear swapping and repairing and alternative sourcing. Like there is an organic level of cooperation that people are still doing through the network that was built, even if formal organizing is branched out into different directions with people pursuing passions in different directions. People are trying to figure out how to repair their mech backpacks or skis because they've never found anything better than the co-op product, and that's really inspiring. But I think that what I walk away from the experience with the most hope is that a lot of people explored what co-ops meant, got connected to local co-ops in different ways, and I'm hoping that if there is like a positive benefit at the end of it, it's that other co-ops are strengthened because people saw what was at risk with what was in their community and got more involved there.
Great. Well, that seems like a great note to wrap it up on. Thanks so much for taking the time, Kevin, and
Yeah, my pleasure.
for bearing with the delays here. And
Oh, don't worry
yeah,
about
is there anything
it.
you'd like to plug, or anything you think people should go look at next?
One is that I would say is take a look at the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives at the University of Saskatchewan. In Canada, we have a francophone cooperative sector and we have an anglophone cooperative sector, and we're building bridges between the two of them. And for folks who aren't lucky enough to be as conversant in French as they are in English, the Canadian Centre for Study of Cooperatives at University of Saskatchewan does a lot of active community building, but also study of cooperatives and trying to spread the knowledge and the form. And they've supported the development of a nonprofit organization called Cooperatives First that goes out into local communities and helps people start cooperatives, in particular in rural and indigenous communities. And there's some really amazing stuff coming out of that. So that's one core plug that I'd give for people to check out. And then beyond that is figure out where the co-ops are in your community, take membership out in them, and then don't let them go the way that Mountain Equipment Co-op went. Stand up, get involved, vote, and redirect your purchases to places that are democratic and member owned.